Pink Board Boroughs. I'm chair of the Eastern Lock Subbasin GSA. A lot of letters in. But we welcome you. Thank you for coming. Looks like a great turnout. That's what we were hoping for. Because we need everybody to understand what we're talking about here today, so we can go forward. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, I believe, and
okay, sure.
get going.
All right, so we let's do a quick introductions. I'm Sarah Wolf. I'm general manager of the Eastside Water District, and I am chairman of the TAC committee. And I'm going to just roll through here. I'm gonna have to introduce them reading it or I'll get messed up, but Ward Burroughs already introduced himself, chairman of the GSA. Tim Johnson is on his way here and he is an alternate for Eastside. Dirk Ulrich with Felico Cortez. Dirk is up here. Dennis Yatsua is here, also on the TAC with me, an alternate for Felico. Lloyd Pereira, not sure if Lloyd's here, supervisor for Merced, and Lacey McBride, his alternate and also on the TAC with me. Hisham Atal from Merced Irrigation District. I don't believe he's here. Matt Beeman is his alternate and on the TAC for Merced Irrigation District. Vito Cheziat, I don't say it. Thank you, from a supervisor from Stanislaus County, and Christy McKinnon is his alternate and on the TAC, and she is here in the room today. Thank you. Yes, Beth.
Can you say the acronyms the first time you're using them?
Sure.
Just so that, because I haven't been coming to speak. So
No problem. I will try to remember to do that.
And if everybody stands up so we can all see your face in case we want to be able to communicate with you later.
Perfect. Okay, we will do our best.
Thank you.
So, ETSGSA is the East Turlock Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And so we'll have a map up here shortly in the presentation, but we're going to go through exactly what our GSA, we are the East Side GSA, what area we cover, and we'll give a quick overview of the GSA in a moment. And so, what? TAC. Oh, TAC, thank you. Didn't know I said that one. Technical Advisory Committee. So we advise the full board of directors of the GSA on some technical items such as this 218. It's reviewed by us first, we give recommendations, then it goes to the board and the board votes on it. So today we're going to have a discussion, a workshop on the 218 process, which is our way of assessing landowners to pay for our GSA and our SGMA implementation in SGMA. It's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that we will cover in a moment. So Mike Tietza here is the general manager of the GSA. And so do you want to say a few words, Mike?
Yeah, so I coordinate our work, our implementation, and I'm responsible for bringing pie. So please help yourself. If we need more chairs, if we can have people keep an eye on that, we can set up some more chairs. So we've got a presentation for you today that's going to go over just a general introduction to SGMA, to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and what we're trying to do. Our background approach, because our approach and what we want to accomplish, of course, is directly tied to what it costs. So we'd like folks to understand both and provide us their input on both. And then we're going to go over this Proposition 218 assessment and some, so that's the tax fee on parcels. And Ryan is our consultant for that. He's going to be introducing that. Caitlin is our legal counsel, because there's legal questions around, how you do these kinds of assessments. So she can answer that and speak to those kinds of questions. And then Savannah Jayden is up here. She's our expert in building, interfaces, internet interfaces for pumpers, like they've done in some of the other basins. And so, while that's not a direct topic today, some of the rules and the policies that need to be adopted, they relate directly to that. So that's why we've got her here today. So I think we can go into our presentation right after the workshop. We are going to be having a board meeting. We have all the board members here. We do have a quorum of the board in the audience, but this is for information only for them. They're not going to be making any decisions at this time, but they may during the board meeting. The decision that we're looking for during the board meeting at this point is not to approve the Proposition 218 assessment. That may occur in January. What we want is direction from the board as to, based on the presentation today, the workshop, the input in the workshop, finalizing and updating the draft engineer's report, which presents the basis for the assessment. And then there's some other matters regarding with our general business and moving forward with our projects and management actions. So with that said, I think, shall we start the presentation?
I think so. Yeah, Ryan's going to share the presentation. And just for those standing in the back, we're grabbing more chairs, but there's some spots in here if you want to come find a seat in the front. There's room, or if you want to grab chairs additionally, have longer arms like Glenn.
And while we're getting ready, so Sarah's going to introduce and present the background of Sigma and what a groundwater sustainability agency is and so forth, because that's kind of the baseline that we're starting from. That's going to be brief. I'll introduce our general approach, and then Ryan will talk about the Proposition 218 assessment. Just while we're getting started, by show of hands, we always like to know how we've engaged with folks. How many people are here today because of an email that you got, just by show of hands? And how many are here by way of a mailing that you received? Okay, and then how many here learned about this by other means, from neighbors, et cetera, so forth? Okay. Also, by show of hands, is the number of emails, newsletters, and so forth, is that okay with you? Do you want to receive more or less? More? Less? A couple less? Just, contact us and we can, take you off the list, or we can develop, two lists. There's a lot of desire for, different levels of engagement. So just, talk to us if you want to see something change there. So with that said, maybe we can start the presentation.
Okay, Savannah, so if you could just close some of those.
Sorry.
It's okay. You didn't know that your screen was one sharing.
Give it started off. Your slide was okay.
Oh, do I want to? Yes, okay, I'll start it off. So we're going to start with the introduction and background. That'll be Sarah, general approach. That'll be me, and then Ryan, proposed Proposition 218 assessment. And then we'll have time for comments and questions. So probably better to save the questions until the end. And then, we want to give a good long time for you to be able to ask questions and to provide input. I think for the size of the audience, it's probably best if we save the questions until the end. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give a quick background on Sigma. Many of you have been here to our other workshops. I think this is our 4th workshop at this point. I might be one off there, but many of you have come, and we've been trying to keep you informed as to what we're doing through this Sigma process. I think today has garnered a lot more interest because we're talking about what we're going to charge you to be part of the Sigma. So obviously we all care about that. But I just want to give a little background on Sigma so we're all on the same page of what we're facing and why we're doing this. So Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed in 2014, and the purpose of it is to achieve groundwater sustainability. I think, I do a lot of work throughout the valley, and I think over the dry periods we've had recently, we have been pumping a lot, and I think that has been affecting all of our well production, and it's very much at times felt very unsustainable. And so we're trying to find, we now have legislation that is demanding that we find a sustainability level for pumping groundwater. And we have 20 years to reach that sustainability. And the legislation stated that they want local control in these plans. So Our whole goal is to make sure the decisions we make are made by those of us here locally so that they're implemented in a way that work for our area. And that was what the legislation says. And if you can't achieve that, then the state is happy to come in and give their guidance and recommendations. So that's what we want to avoid. We want to keep those decisions here locally. And so just to go through the timeline, we formed the GSA. You had to form a GSA in 2017. Developed our GSP. We were not required to have ours developed until January of 2022, which we did. We submitted that in January 2022, and we have 20 years to implement. And then by 2042, we should be at sustainability as the goal. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, this is the map of who East Side GSA is. This is the map covering our area. It includes East Side Water District, Belico Cortez Water District, Merced Irrigation District along the Merced River on the east side of the Merced River, Merced County and Stanislaus County. And our partner in this is the West Turlock GSA, primarily made up of the communities on the west side and Turlock Irrigation District. And with that GSA and our GSA, we submitted one GSP, which is the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And so we have one plan for the entire Turlock Basin that we submitted in January 2022.
So wait, Sarah, so go over the colors, make sure everybody.
So the blue is East Side Water District. The orange to the north is Stanislaus County. The red to the south is Belico. The yellow is Merced County. I believe I have this right. And the green is Merced Irrigation District.
What about the people that are like just east of the orange? Are they not in it?
They are not in a GSA. They are not required to adhere to SGMA. So the state drew the boundaries of what the area that needed to comply is, and that's the easterly boundary of that.
Yeah, it's based on a geologic boundary, so it's, the aquifers get thicker, of course, the further west you go, in the valley fill. So that boundary to the east is actually a geologic boundary.
Thank you.
What again was the orange?
The orange, I believe, was Stanislaus County. So that's Stanislaus County and Merced County areas are not represented by any irrigation district. So the county is stepping in to be their overarching authority. So many people call that the white area.
Where is Turlock?
Turlock Lake is the green, kind of in the middle of the orange and blue up there.
Right, there's Turlock Lake.
And then there's a thin strip of West Turlock, Groundwater Sustainability Agency along the main canal coming down here.
So if you're on Lake Road.
You're on Lake Road. You're in our GSA.
So that the taxes they come,
We're going straight to the taxes.
is this whole,
This whole area is what we're discussing would be assessed today. That all of this colored landmass would be responsible for the tax that we're going to discuss today.
We can provide more detailed maps of, all the parcels, and we know which parcels are in and which parcels are out.
Okay, all right, next slide. So just another slide of the subbasin as a whole. The side here on the left, that's the whole subbasin. The blue is Turlock, or West Turlock subbasin or GSA. The red is East Turlock GSA, which we just had highlighted in the multiple colors. So that's just a broader picture. One of our major drivers in decision-making around how we reach sustainability is this cone of depression that you see on the right. So that's a groundwater elevation map. on the right. And as you can see, it gets smaller and smaller as you get towards the center. That is a depressed area where the groundwater levels have gotten very low. So that is a focus area for us that we want to reverse. We want to make that a better situation for the entire basin. And then we just have some highlights, over 90,000 acres of high value agricultural land, mostly nuts and vines in our area. And we are almost exclusively, not exclusively, but very close to exclusively reliant on groundwater in this area. Next.
Is there any chance that surface water would be available to people in the future?
Yep, we'll talk about that in just a second. So you go straight to taxes and the solutions. So our general approach, how we're gonna tackle this is we intend to, we're gonna come up with some programs, some plans and ways to both lower demand, so reduce how much groundwater we need and bring in alternative supplies. So having a combination of both. And in all likelihood, see 2022, we were somewhat erratic in how much we were pumping our groundwater. We're probably going to continue a little bit on a downward path until we implement some of those programs to allow us to go back up to a positive path with the groundwater levels. And this is really what will drive us are these minimum thresholds, meaning how low will we allow the groundwater levels to get to? So we have monitoring wells, I'll show a map in a moment, around the GSA that are monitoring our groundwater levels. And we're reporting on those annually to state. And we have thresholds of where we can't get below. If we start to get close to those, we're gonna have to take alternative actions. But that is, these thresholds of our groundwater levels are what's determining where we need to focus, what we need to do, how much pumping and demand management we need to do. So next slide, I think is this is how we'll deal with it. We have, we have to we'll discuss in great detail today. We have to pay for all of this, the operations, all of these people that are helping make this come together and work and be compliant. And then we're going to go and implement projects, whether that is new surface supply coming in when we're able to get it, pipelines to deliver excess flows when there are available flood flows like last year, recharge basins where they can produce, great groundwater percolation. And then we'll also do management actions, which are things like reducing actual acreage that is farmed in the district, doing some land fallowing, doing some projects that maybe rotate fallowing in between orchard redevelopment for a period of 3 years. We'll take some actions to support and reduce our demand. Next slide. So on detailed of what's on the operating side, we will be doing data collection of an analysis. So all of those minimum thresholds and the groundwater levels, we're collecting that data annually and putting it together in an annual report and submitting it to the state, but also analyzing it ourselves to make sure that we engage in the right projects that make a positive impact on us. We're planning it. We've done the GSP, but now it is these plans moving forward, annual reports to show what we're doing and to justify our actions in the GSA. Monitoring is a big component of the district, responding to when we do hit those minimum thresholds, how we do that. Compliance reporting, as I mentioned, annual report, and then the GSA, GSP administration. And then on the project side, we have in lieu recharge projects. Many of you did that this year with replenishment water from TID. You took surface water instead of running your wells. That's one of the best things we can do in the district to reduce our demand. So whenever there is water availability, you don't turn on your well and you take that surface water. Direct recharge projects, we had a number of those this year. Dispersed recharge, land repurposing, other demand reduction, and pumping management. Those are on the project sides.
Sir, probably we can just point out the Proposition 218 assessment that we're talking about today is to pay for our operations. That's what's on the left in the kind of orange and brown colors. And the projects and management actions, those will be paid for by a groundwater extraction fee. That's not being presented today or up for decision by the board in the near future, but we'll talk further about that in the spring.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So this is just a pictorial of kind of how we will deal with the demand reduction in the project. So the blue line is, well, the total columns is how much we're pumping. The blue, up to the blue line is where we would be sustainable, where we want to get to. The red is over pumping. The blue and white striped is the projects. And then the red, I believe, is demand reduction. So fallowing and not pumping as much. So you want to have a combination of all of these things that are lowering your demand down into, so if you see in the last, these are broken up into 5-year increments. The last set of 5 years, we're at a sustainable level where we have enough projects and we fallowed enough ground that we're only pumping a sustainable amount. So that's,
Where are we right now? What, I can't read.
we're in the all red to the left.
There's 2020.
2022 is this first column,
Okay.
and then 2042 is the last column. The numbers on the left are percentage of average estimated sustainable yield.
So what, the sustainable yield is ultimately, what we're gonna be managing to, right? But, we have a model, we have some data, we don't know exactly what the sustainable yield is. We have a preliminary estimate. And so what we're doing is you can see that we're gradually, phasing in the management actions and the projects, and we're reevaluating every 5 years, because as we learn more, we don't want to either undershoot or overshoot. You know, we want to get it right. Yes, sir.
Does this sustainable yield factor in water needed for the West Turlock subbasin to clean up their water?
No, this factors in, this is really based on our east side sustainable yield needs. The West Turlock side has a different, they have more of a conjunctive use program because they have a surface supply coming in. And so they're maintaining a supply and demand number based on their surface supplies and their groundwater pumping that they're calculating and tracking on their side.
And no outside of the East Turlock subbasin is being considered in the demand, in the required water reduction.
Not for our numbers, it's east side only.
Yeah, I mean, they relate, obviously, groundwater flows between the two areas. For our management purposes, what we've done is we've taken an estimate so that we have a target that we can work towards. But ultimately, the sustainable yield is a number in our plan that's for the whole subbasin. They have responsibility for what they can do on their side. We have responsibility for what we can do on our side. And that sustainable yield is the number that was estimated in the groundwater sustainability plan that prevents what they call undesirable results. And those undesirable results include, 3 things that are maybe of most concern to us. The first one is just a chronic drop in the groundwater levels, because that can cause people's wells to go dry, make it more expensive to pump. And then depleted storage, which means that you may not have the groundwater storage available that you need when you need it. So that even if you wanted to pump, if it wasn't available, that, that's an undesirable result that we're trying to avoid. And then the last one is depletion of surface water, because both the Merced River and the Tuolumne River are connected to the groundwater system. That cone of depression that's formed in the middle, that's basically drawing water away from the Tuolumne River and the Merced River into that cone of depression. And so that's something that needs to be managed. I mean, it's going to occur, right? But it needs to be managed at a level where it's acceptable. And we've set the thresholds and the framework, and in our plan agreed to how do we define what's acceptable. And then once every 5 years, we revisit that plan and see, do we need to redefine what's acceptable? Do we know more? Can we pump more, or should we pump less? Or are we good where we are? And that's assessed once every 5 years. So go ahead, Sarah.
Next slide. So this is just another depiction of how we intend to reach sustainability. The top bar is 95,701 acre feet is our net deficit, how much we are over pumping at this point. And it's broken up per year, yes. And this is broken up into 5-year increments. And, you know, as I said earlier, we're going to implement some projects. We have the light blue, our projects that are in our GSP, like bringing in surface supplies, doing recharge ponds. The dark blue is dispersed recharge, so additional recharge we can get from stream flows and various activities that occur with rain events. The green is MLRP program or projects. We were granted $8.5 million. $8.89 million by the Department of Conservation to implement a multi-benefit land repurposing program, MLRP. And what that means is it is a program where we can structure, develop activities in our GSA that will reduce demand reduction by putting in either habitat programs or land fallowing in the swales where maybe you aren't getting good production. We would, through future assessments and through the MLRP program, pay you to take those lands out of production. We also could put in some beaver dams, correct? Am I saying that correctly?
They call them beaver dam analogs, so
Beaver dam
we're not
analogs, I
releasing
mean,
beavers.
To catch some of these major rain events and allow them to percolate and get us some recharge. So that is it's a big win for our GSA that we have that. Merced also has that program, MLRP, as does Stanislaus. So I think there's going to be a lot of coordination between those 3 areas that we can do some really good things with that program to reduce our demand. The other green is delayed orchard replanting. And this is, I referenced it a little bit earlier, but if you're taking an orchard out because it's aged out and you plan on redeveloping, we would pay you to take it out, to leave it fallow for 3 years so that we would get some of that demand reduction over the 3 years. And then you would go back in and replant after the 3-year period to help increase our demand reduction numbers. So
Sorry, I just wanted to say something about this slide when you
Go
have a
ahead.
moment. Okay, so I usually like to introduce this slide by saying that the only thing that we know for sure about these numbers and the different ways to fix them on the right is that they're wrong, okay? But they're the best numbers that we have at this point, and we need something to be able to use for planning. And these things over here and their estimated costs are the basis for how much it'll cost to pump water, okay? And right now you can see that on balance, we have a lot of green, and the green is land repurposing to a non-irrigated use or irrigation demand reduction. And you know, what we'd like to do is provide folks with a menu that they can use and then provide them incentive payments for different ways to repurpose their land that can either help with habitat, recharge, water quality, you know, that can help in some other way and be integrated into your operation. So that's these things right here. We would like to shift the boundary between the green and the blue further this way, right? The more green and blue we implement, that our orange overdraft goes down. And we'd like to do as much as possible by bringing new water into the basin. But right now, this is all we can count on. So we have, we're working with Turlock Irrigation District, looking at making up to about 35,000 acre feet per year of replenishment water available. That's still under discussion. It may be that they can provide more, depending on how their water rights application for stormwater on the Tuolumne River goes, but we can't count on that at this point. And they can't commit to it.
Yes, sir.
Your menu of options, do you have any idea what you foresee being on that menu?
So we are in the early planning stages right now. We'll be reaching out to you, to growers, to build that menu of options. We've got I don't think I have the slide in here, but we have a list. And they include things like what we'll entertain anything, okay? But the list includes things and focuses on things that can be integrated into a working landscape as opposed to just retiring or fallowing. We'd like to get away from that kind of approach and nomenclature to repurposing in some way that provides a benefit that allows a sustainable agriculture, water sustainable agricultural economy to persist, right? This is a lot of acres. At the end, our current estimate, if it goes according to this plan, it'd be 21,000 acres. And so what we'd like to see is things like orchard swale rewilding. A lot of swales in the orchards, trees don't do as well because they get waterlogged or the cold settles in the swales. If you can take those trees out and put in some check dams, you can build habitat. There's the potential in the future that we want to look into. Maybe you can even get some kind of habitat credit. It decreases flood flows, increases, potentially increases pollinator habitat. We can look at things like hedgerows. We can look at things like building on-site recharge ponds or retention basins that you can use during the early irrigation season. And the intention is for every acre, the GSA would pay you to implement that and would provide you, standard designs for implementing it, and would get programmatic permits for implementing it so that the permitting requirements are more manageable. So that's our intention. Some of the other things on the list are things like we want to take a close look at what kind of cover cropping might be able to help with that, if that's something that you were minded to implement. On-site small solar to augment your pumping energy needs. So these, we have a list of about 10 or 12 things. Buffer zones where crops are taken out to produce buffer zones. What we want to, we may do larger engineered projects, but right now we think that offering options that can be integrated by growers into their operation is a better way for us to go. It's more bang for the buck, gives you more flexibility. We just don't have huge amounts of surface water available that warrant us building a big infrastructure project. If we had it available, we would jump on it in a second. And that may happen in the future, but right now we can't count on it. Okay.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So rules and regulations, all of these activities that we're talking about implementing will need rules and regulations, so you know how that will work for your farm. So we are in the process of developing these rules and regulations that will guide us through these various projects. And we're going to have some that support justification of the ratepayer benefits. So there are some that need to go along with this 218 that we're discussing today. Definitions and framework, measuring groundwater use. We are putting together the regulations on how we will monitor groundwater use. We intend to, and have actually contracted with the company Land IQ to do ET monitoring on our behalf. We're developing a portal that you will be able to access as a grower. Our intention is that we worked with a small handful of growers last year on their water use. We're going through those numbers with them now, analyzing it. But next year in 2024, we are hoping to engage all of you in a portal that you can go into and look at your groundwater use, analyze it. This would be post after your use. Land IQ provides the data back to us a month to a month and a half later. So it's not live that you would make changes on your farm, but it's for you to analyze and utilize for future years and to adjust as you go forward into the next year. So 2024, we're gonna use it as a time where you all can just engage with it, give us feedback, we can tweak it. And then 2025 is when we would anticipate implementing the use of Land IQ for purposes of monitoring and charging you a fee for your groundwater pumping. So,
Sarah?
yes,
ET?
evapotranspiration. So satellite imagery to determine how much crop uptake of the water supply you have and determine what your use of water is on that crop. So we will be many more workshops to go through all of that with you all today, but those are rules and regulations that'll have to be put in place to support those actions. And then we'll have rules and regulations around supporting volume-based pumping fees, which, as Mike mentioned, we will get to in early spring of 2024. Okay, we do have some questions in the chat. Do we want to see if we can answer those really quickly?
Yeah, I think we can do it pretty quick. One of the questions was, would projects in the West Turlock GSA qualify for the multi-benefit land repurposing program funding?
Well, projects on the West Turlock side qualify for the multi-benefit land repurposing, and the answer is West Turlock is a partner with us in this MLRP program. It's not clear yet what projects they would like to implement on their side, but we are definitely in conversations with them about what projects would be made available to the West Turlock side. But yes, it's not clarified yet what those will be.
Yeah, I mean, the plan is for the whole sub-basin. And they're a partner with us in developing this. So yeah, it's not clear yet. We're expecting most of it would be in the east, but that some will be in the west as well.
Okay, and then the last question in the chat that we can address right now is a good one. What is the estimated sustainable yield for East Turlock GSA, and when will that be defined?
So when will it be defined? It'll be defined on an ongoing basis. We'll get a better idea of what it is. Right now, we're not saying that it's a number that we can regulate to, okay? We can back it out of, for East Turlock Subbasin, we can back it out of the modeling that's done, and it comes out at about 145,000 acre feet per year. And our current demand is somewhere north of 240,000. So, you know, that's where the 95,000 reduction number comes from. But that's a rough number. You know, as a friend of mine is fond of saying, it's dark down there, right? And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we use the information that we have, but that we use it appropriately. And we'll learn more as we go, but right now we can't define exactly what that number is.
Got a question?
Some of the cities with their wells, they assessments for how much they dropped.
So we don't have any
Repeat the question.
incorporated, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was regarding the cities that are groundwater users, are they assessed and how do they participate in the GSP process? East Turlock Subbasin, we have Snelling. Belico is actually in the West Turlock Subbasin. It's also unincorporated. So we have no municipal water systems. We have maybe a couple of small community water systems, domestic wells, and primarily irrigation wells, and then, you know, a few processing and industrial wells. All parcels participate, and all wells for uses that pump more than the domestic amount or a stock amount will participate in the next phase when we have a volume-based extraction. In the West Turlock Subbasin, they're handling their finances differently. I can't speak to that, but the cities and the towns participate in the GSP and sit on their board and contribute funding to its implementation.
Will the monitoring eventually move to flow meters?
We are anticipating that we will use ET data to determine as our method of monitoring. However, if you as a landowner choose to go to a flow meter and it's calibrated and of the specs that we put out as necessary, then you could utilize a flow meter. But at this moment in time, we don't have the funding or the plans to have ever to pay for people to put in flow meters. So it's an option for you as a landowner, as your primary or as a backup. It just has to meet certain criteria that will be necessary to know that it's calibrated and so forth. Yes.
So you've used the word fallow several times, and that brings up bad images, but then I also think about, there's gotta be some undeveloped land in our area, and what happens if somebody wants to develop it and start using water? Is that allowed?
So we have lands that are determined or currently assessed as non-irrigated. You'll see this in the 218, they pay a lower fee, considerably lower. And, under our plan, if they are a non-irrigated parcel, they would not be getting the ability to pump the same amount of groundwater as an irrigated parcel. So it would be through your assessed land value. And so if you're paying that cheaper price and you're not developed, you also aren't getting a groundwater allocation with that, or an amount that you can pump.
Let me maybe add to that a little bit. So at this point, we don't have an allocation system per se, because we don't know exactly what the sustainable yield is. If you own property, you have water rights. And we're not going to interfere with those water rights. But what we can tell you is that currently we have irrigated parcels and non-irrigated parcels. If there's a parcel that's non-irrigated that starts to be irrigated, it would be assessed at the irrigated rate. And it would be, they would have to pay, or if we adopt a volume-based extraction fee, they'd need to pay for that extraction fee. I can tell you that for expanding demand at a time when we know that we need to cut back, there are probably additional hoops that somebody would need to jump through. In fact, I know there's additional hoops that somebody would need to jump through in order to be able to develop a new supply. I'm not going to tell you that it's impossible. I'm just going to say that, there's additional hoops that you would need to jump through to make sure that it's consistent with what's happening under the groundwater sustainability plan.
You guys, it's okay. I know there's other questions, but we do want to, I'm just worried about, I'll take one more right back here. Raise your hand.
Yes, you mentioned that non-irrigated parcels or non-irrigated lands would be a fee for them as well. Why would that be the case?
Why do they have a lower fee?
Well, why would
They
they
have any fee.
Why would they have any fee at all?
Because they are required to, they do have to come into compliance with Sigma. They're required to be part of the program. They do receive benefit from being part of the program, in that if they have domestic wells, or if they are able to get stock water, that water supply is still viable and healthy. They also, if they were not part of our program and paying into it, they would have to be regulated by the state. And so the state has determined that those lands do have to come into compliance as well, even if they're not irrigated. And additionally, they may not be irrigated now, but to Mike's point, if they have intention of someday being irrigated, or they have development opportunities, they need to be part of the plan and showing how they are participating in that. So I don't know if there's more that others want to.
I would just add that, I spoke with a cattle rancher last night that had the same question. And, how you answer these questions always depends on exactly where you sit and what your situation is, right? So we get that. So we do believe that there is benefit to unirrigated parcels through improved water management, both in terms of potential future availability of water, as well as regional economic benefits, property values, and so forth. But we think that that benefit is a lot less than the benefit to the irrigated parcels. So what we've tried to do is to develop a fair approach to valuing the benefit to non-irrigated versus irrigated parcels. So that's, yeah.
So why don't we get into the 218, into the funding, and that way you can see the differences, and Ryan is gonna walk through those slides with us.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm gonna give you a little bit of kind of background on funding within the GSA's jurisdiction. And then talk a little bit more about this proposed assessment that we're here to really focus on today. So many of you may be aware that the GSA does have a current fee program, and then Eastside Water District has a current assessment. And those two parts kind of make up the current funding situation within the GSA. So the current program that the GSA has is a fee charged both to non-irrigated lands and irrigated lands, similar to what we're talking about today, where there's kind of a different rate for each. And then Eastside Water District, or EWD, charges an assessment to their parcels, and then they contribute to the GSA on behalf of their parcels. So that's kind of the way it's set up right now. I will say that a part of the reason for why we're looking at doing this is that current fee program was really established to pay for GSP development and GSA administration, kind of in the initial phases, and it does not generate enough revenue to implement the plan and the things that Mike and Sarah were talking about just a few minutes ago. So we're kind of at this point where we're looking at this, what we're calling an operational assessment to really support the GSA's operational activities in implementing the GSP. So we have alluded to this a little bit already. We're looking at potentially adopting two funding mechanisms here. So the first is what's called a benefit assessment in early 2024 to fund the operational budget through land-based charges. That's the focus of today's workshop. And the second would be a property-related fee later in 2024 and looking towards 2025 to support the project budget through groundwater use-based charges. So those would be charged proportional to groundwater use. We will be having a separate workshop regarding that and possibly other workshops regarding the policies, rules, and regulations that go into that as well. More information will be made available on that as we're able. As far as how this new proposed assessment relates to the current funding mechanisms, if the proposed assessment is successful, it would replace ETSGSA's current fee program, so that would go away and the new assessment would take its place. Eastside Water District, their current assessment is set to expire in 2025. And so the way it would work is Eastside Water District properties would continue to pay their existing assessment, and Eastside Water District would pay the new assessment on behalf of their property owners, in part with funds from that current assessment. I apologize, I know that sounds like I just talked in a circle a little bit there, but I will discuss that in a little more detail here in a few slides also. So this just kind of visually illustrates what we've been describing. You see we have on the left kind of two different buckets in terms of revenue needs or budgets. There's the operational budget, which includes costs related to administration, compliance with SGMA, general operations, compliance management actions, so kind of programs that ensure SGMA compliance, and then debt service as well. And then the project and management action budget includes costs related to some of the recharge projects that were described a few minutes ago. And then other management actions described in the groundwater sustainability plan for achieving sustainability. So that operational budget feeds into the land-based assessment with a rate per irrigated parcel acre and a rate per non-irrigated parcel acre. And that PNMA or project and management action budget would feed into a groundwater use-based fee. And that would likely look like a rate per acre foot on kind of a base tier and then potential overdraft tiers as well. Again, that's kind of still being developed and thought through. Not sure exactly what that will look like, but more information will be coming down the pipe. So I wanted to talk a bit about benefit assessments. This is a very specific type of funding mechanism that was first described by Proposition 218. So I wanted to talk about some of the procedural requirements that go into that and what that will look and feel like as we try to go forward here. So benefit assessments require greater than 50% support, or 50% plus one, it's sometimes described as, through an all-male landowner election. So it's a fairly unique process. All affected landowners will receive a ballot and notice, and on that ballot, it will list the proposed assessment amount for your parcel or parcels, as well as a total. One thing about this that's important to note is that it's a weighted ballot, which means you can think of it as $1 equals one vote. So the higher assessment you have, the more voting power you have. So somebody that has a $10 assessment, and their neighbor has a $100 assessment, the $100 assessment neighbor has 10 times the voting power. So it's weighted that way, and so when it's tabulated in process, that's taken into consideration. So once the ballots have been mailed, there will be a 60-day voting period. Proposition 218 requires 45 days, but we've elected to go with 60 to ensure everybody has time to submit. And then at the close of this voting period, there will be a public hearing and a ballot tabulation to process the results. So during that time period, landowners may mail their ballot to the GSA, but they may also hold off and bring the ballot to the public hearing. At that public hearing, there will be a last call for ballots, at which point people can hand theirs in person. And then the balloting at that point will close and the tabulation will begin. Also, during that voting period, if anyone needs a replacement ballot, they can be requested from the GSA, whether it gets lost or it got lost in the mail for whatever reason, a replacement ballot can be issued. So don't hesitate to reach out if that is the case. And then again, if greater than 50% or 50% plus one of the submitted ballots vote in favor of the assessment, it can then be implemented by the board. If we don't reach that threshold, then it cannot be.
Who runs that part of it?
The tabulation, so that will likely take place at a board meeting in full view of the public, and we'll be involved in potentially GSA staff as well. Those details are still kind of being worked out, but either way, it'll be in a public forum. Okay, wanted to talk a little bit about some budget considerations here and what goes into that operational budget. Mike and Sarah have discussed that in some detail already, but I wanted to kind of show you how we got to the annual revenue need that will feed into this assessment. So there's several rows here. You'll notice there's the base operational budget, is that first one in the light blue. So that's kind of the basics. And then we have a line for debt service as well. The GSA has taken out a loan, and so that's incorporated in this as well. And then at the bottom, we have the total operational budget. And in order to kind of smooth out the rate and the revenue need here, the way we've come to this number is we've projected the budget out over 8 years, from fiscal year 24-25 through 31-32. And then we've taken an 8-year average, and that's the number you see there in red. And so the way that kind of works is, even though the annual expenses may fluctuate, you see on the left side there, in blue is the annual income that stays the same, and the expenses fluctuate. Those first 4 years, the expenses are slightly less, and in the second 4 years, those expenses are slightly higher than the projected revenue from the assessment. But on the right, you can see, even though those lines diverge a bit in the middle, they end up at the same place over that 8-year span. And so looking at all the pieces of the budget and projecting those costs outward, and then using that 8-year average is kind of how we came to this annual revenue need. Do you want me to run through these? I think.
I can run
Yeah,
through
okay.
that. So this just kind of gives you an idea of some of the activities that are being paid for by this. We have a total of 43 groundwater monitoring wells located throughout the eastern part of the subbasin. And those help us to assess, are we complying with those thresholds that we talked about that are in the GSP? You know, are we meeting our targets, which we're required under the law to meet? Some of them are what we call electronic wells. They have little pressure measurement, water level measurement devices that give us more of an idea of how the water changes in between the spring and fall monitoring events. But we monitor all of them in the spring and fall. We report once a year to the DW, excuse me, twice a year to the DWR. By uploading our data directly to them, and then we have annual reports once a year. And then those wells need to be maintained. Sometimes they'll fail, they need to be replaced. And we are working on putting in some additional wells where we have data gaps near the rivers. Right now, we've got DWR that's going to, under what they call their technical support services program. We applied with them to get some funds for them to put some wells in for us that are not going to cost us anything. Next slide. This is our compliance management actions. So I mentioned annual reporting. Those annual reports include the water levels. They budget information that's put together. There's certain specific things that DWR requires that we report. There's a little bit of groundwater modeling and calculation that goes into that, and then we need to report on what projects and management actions we implement. The 5-year GSP updates, we have both an opportunity and an obligation once every 5 years to revisit our groundwater sustainability plan, assess how we're doing, look for opportunities to do better. That also requires some modeling and analysis. Pumping management. So I mean, there's two things really that are primary to our management program. One is understanding what groundwater levels are doing, and then the other is managing pumping, right? I mean, this is aside from projects to bring as much water in as possible. And the pumping management requires the rules and regulations and policies. There's the evapotranspiration monitoring so that we can estimate how much is being pumped. Are we trending in the right direction? And then a portal interface so that everyone can see and it's transparent and get the information out there and correct any mistakes. Domestic well mitigation and minimum threshold exceedance. Those are two things that we've identified as actions that are going to need to be taken in the future. So domestic well impacts are something that DWR is very sensitive to. And so we are developing a program to look at and see, what actions are we responsible to take and when. Minimum threshold exceedance, what happens if we're below those water levels where we say that we don't want to go? What's the action that's taken? Because with all these things, you kind of usually want to do a tiered response. First, you want to determine, do we really have a problem? Are we measuring it accurately? And if so, okay, does it warrant action? What kind of action does it warrant? So that program is being developed. And then just general planning and implementation management. Next slide. Regional coordination, groundwater flows between basins. So we're coordinating regionally to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with what they're doing across the river or across our boundary. Stakeholder and community engagement, it's part of what this is about. We want to make sure that, local management requires that we know what's going on and what people want. Meetings, business and finance, staff and legal, I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
Okay. Thank you. So I wanted to dig a little deeper into the assessment methodology, or essentially the basis of the charges and kind of the rationale behind them. We've talked about that a little bit already, but I wanted to talk in a little more detail. So as we've mentioned, the proposed rates, there are two. So one for an irrigated parcel acre and one for a non-irrigated parcel acre. In terms of that irrigation status, in some cases that may be obvious, but the baseline determination of a parcel's designation as irrigated or non-irrigated stems from county use codes and from Department of Water Resource or DWR land use mapping. This may be refined in the future using other data sources, including the ET or evapotranspiration data that was mentioned. But that's kind of the baseline determination. Parcels will then be charged based on that status as irrigated or non-irrigated according to their total acreage per the assessor's lien rule. So the data the county has on the acreage of parcels. Also wanted to note that an appeals process is being developed and will likely be adopted in the next month or two. Kind of figuring out a process through which property owners can submit an appeal if they feel their property has been incorrectly categorized. So that is something that is in motion as well, kind of concurrently with this. Sure.
We have about 60 acres of waterway that runs through one of our ranches. How's that gonna be assessed? Non-irrigated, it's not. I mean, I could be assessed for the river running through my ranch.
Mike, can you speak to that?
Sorry, I was responding to somebody. I understand the question. So the question was, if you have open water in your ranch, you're going to be assessed for that acreage. So currently we've identified parcels that based on use codes and based on field mapping that are considered irrigated. We are gonna have to refine that, and we do have an appeals process that, we're going to be adopting along with the or we're gonna be processing along with the assessment. And that appeals process will allow things like that to be addressed. I would note that, your base allowance for pumping, is envisioned, so this is for the future pumping fee that we would be adopting. That base allowance will be based on parcel acres, okay? And if folks want to change some of their parcel acres to non-irrigated in recognition that, they could possibly irrigate a river, for example, then you would no longer get a base allowance for that acreage. So there's a decision that you need to make, which better suits you.
Thank you, Mike. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to touch back on how we intend to handle East Side Water District parcels who are currently paying their own assessment. As I noted, that assessment goes to East Side Water District, who then pays into the GSA on behalf of those parcels. So if this proposed new assessment is successful, East Side Water District will pay the new assessment on behalf of its property owners while that assessment is active, so through 2025. Once that current East Side Water District assessment expires, those property owners would then be charged directly for this new assessment instead of the one that then at that point had expired. So there's some kind of somewhat complicated things here happening with timing, but that's how we want to address this. They will not, East Side Water District property owners will not be concurrently charged for their existing assessment and the new one at the same time. They're going to phase one out and bring the other in. As far as balloting those parcels, because funds will either be paid on their behalf or then after a few years directly from those property owners, they will be balloted with the same voting power and in the same manner as all other property owners within the jurisdiction of the GSA. So they'll be included in that process that I was describing in terms of the all-mail ballot.
I have a question.
Yes.
You correct me if I'm wrong, when the East Side Water District imposed the direct charge on the property taxes, I called the assessor's office to find out how that happened, and I was told that it was a vote. But we got a postcard that said we needed to send a letter of opposition to that charge. And most of us, I think, threw the postcard away. So is that gonna be the same situation with this vote, or is it actually gonna be a vote?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question and allowing me to clarify. So there are some different procedural requirements included in Proposition 218. One is a protest hearing and one is a balloting. And it's a little complicated and there's different rules and different things apply in different situations. This will be a balloting. So it will be a ballot that is sent to you. It will have, a yes, no checkbox. Essentially, it'll have, as I stated, the proposed assessment amount for your parcel or parcels. And you'll mail that back in, or you can bring it in person. So yes, this will be slightly different from that protest hearing situation. It will be a balloting. And then at the close of that balloting period, we'll tabulate those results and look at the percentage of support. If it's greater than 50, it goes. If not, it doesn't.
Brian, excuse me, it's good, not gonna be slightly different, there's a huge difference, okay?
Yeah.
We gotta, if we wanna fix this, you guys, then this election is really, really critical to get moving in that direction, okay? And we have to get those ballots returned to us. The one you're talking about, like you said, it's a protest vote. So by not sending it in, that was a yes vote, right? Okay, so this is completely different.
Yeah, so let me just, I'll repeat what the question was that's being answered here in case folks online didn't hear it. And that was that the previous assessment within EWD was a protest vote, and folks got postcards that they should send in if they protest. So not sending it in is the equivalent of a yes vote. This assessment is different. Under the law, it requires that it's all by mail, but under the law, it requires that a majority of the landowner assessed parcel acres vote yes in order for it to pass. To kind of add to the complexity, which is unavoidable, if we process an extraction fee early next year. Again, I remind you, that's not on the table right now, but if we do that, that will also be a protest vote. So that'll be different from what we're talking about today.
Similar to what the gentleman described before. That other part would look like that if it's implemented.
On this 218 vote, what if a landowner does not put his vote in?
So the percentage, that 50% threshold is of the submitted ballots. Does that address your question? Yeah, so if somebody doesn't vote, it's not like a yes, it's like a non-vote. So that the way we'll be calculating that support threshold is of the submitted ballots. So let's say nobody in the sub-basin or within the GSA submits a ballot except for one person, and that's a no, it doesn't pass. So it doesn't take into account ballots are not submitted, only ones that are submitted.
Yeah, I think the non-irrigated land should be assessed according to income, and there's hardly any income on non-irrigated land. 35 bucks an acre, maybe at the best, up to $50 an acre, and you're at 15% on the difference between 255 and 1730, and it's too high.
He's absolutely right. I'm a homeowner. I have 150 acres and it's non-irrigated. I don't have any income.
We lose money on running cattle almost every year, and we're being assessed, and we don't have a right to drill a well because it's an overdraft.
So I can understand that thought. I will say that for this type of funding mechanism, things like property value or income cannot go into the calculation. There are specific.
That's how they base that.
I'm sorry?
The Williamson Act is based on income.
There are other things such as, like, for example, like ad valorem property tax does take those things into account. But this is a very particular and specific funding mechanism described in Prop 218 and the state constitution. And so what goes into the calculation of those things is in some ways prohibitive. It doesn't allow for any method of that calculation.
So I think just in response to what you said, we're considering now the draft engineer's report. This is not up for adoption until acceptance of the engineer's report won't occur until January. So until that time, if you have specific comments that you want us to consider, I think it's important for us to hear those. And in specific, we haven't had a lot of comments from non-irrigated landowners. What we have tried to do is to set the assessment for non-irrigated land in proportion to what we think the benefit is, which is much smaller than it is for irrigated land. And if there's comments as to, did we get it right? Are we not considering it fully? Those are the kinds of comments that I think we need to receive before the January board meeting.
So what if you're a non-irrigated land and you live on the river? And if you even have access to water, and you're in an area that is not being in subsidence or in an area of cone depression, is that you're in an area that's actually distributing water to the rest of the area that you should be exempt from these.
Yeah, the question was, what about, for example, riparian land or land that's near a river that is not extracting groundwater and has not contributed therefore to the overdraft? Why are they being assessed? And we've wrestled with that question. And the conclusion that we came to is two things. One is, and this is outlined in the engineer's report. One is we do believe that everybody benefits in the base case from responsible water resources management, of which groundwater resources management is a part, right? So if we pump less groundwater, we're taking less water from the river, and more water is available for river and riparian use in the future. So that's part of it. And part of it is that if we have a sensible, water management strategy that avoids state intervention, which they promise they will do if we don't meet our goals, then I think it's a better approach for everybody. The second component is that our philosophy is to try to avoid carving up the area into little special benefit areas, okay? I know that there are, or I should say, we know that there is a strong drive to do that. Because, you know, at the beginning, you saw the cartoon with the two fish, one has its gills in the water, one has its gills out of the water. How you perceive this personally for your property is gonna be unique to you. But if we start carving up smaller and smaller, we're not gonna get to the finish line. That's our philosophy, is that we need to go there together, but that what we need to do is provide enough of a rationale to make it, you know, to make it fair for everybody to go together. And I'll just add one final thing, which is that that's also part of the reason that we've decided that in order to pay for our projects and the management actions for demand reduction, that those dollars are only gonna come from groundwater pumpers that pump more than 2 acre-feet per year. Because it's not fair to have the non-pumpers or the folks that are pumping less than 2 acre-feet per year to contribute to that part. And to the extent that anybody contributes, it should be in proportion to how much they're pumping. So that's our attempt to answer your question, is that we've taken a large part of the expenses to get to sustainability, and we've tied that to a future groundwater extraction fee. And the rest is divided up in between irrigated and non-irrigated parcels, because our conclusion was that everybody benefits from responsible groundwater management. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that if those folks don't join in this 218, that they would be subject to state controls. Do you have the numbers of what that state proposes to charge for that service?
So the state's always ready to help, right? The question from Lloyd Pereira was that if folks don't join, then they're subject to state control potentially, and what are the numbers for that? So I just want to provide a little bit of clarification that state intervention is something that happens under one of a couple of different circumstances. It's either they find that your plan is inadequate, and there's various basins that are dealing with that now. They're getting set to do hearings on are their plans adequate or inadequate? Is their basin going to go into probationary status? And then the second is you're not meeting your goals and they need to intervene. And in both cases, what the state does is they would have a hearing to see are you adequate or inadequate. They would provide you a laundry list of items that you need to correct. So you need to pay to correct those things. In the meantime, all wells would be required to be registered. And they can require all wells to be metered. $300 per well for registration, metering at your expense. $40 per acre foot is the extraction fee, and it can go up to $50 per acre foot if they have their own interim groundwater sustainability plan. And they have the ability to curtail pumping, and in which case it's not voluntary. You get a letter that says you shall curtail pumping to X amount, and if you don't, you'll be subject to these penalties. Now that's what they can do. It doesn't mean that they will do it. But it's generally, I mean, you know, we talk about undesirable results in Sigma. I mean, that's the real undesirable result that we're trying to avoid.
Have they implemented that too?
The question is, have they implemented it? At this point, no, but there's about a half dozen basins that are slated for hearings, and we're watching very closely to see what are they actually going to do, and to what extent are they going to work with folks to try to avoid those things rather than putting the hammer down.
How far south are they?
Larry Lake Subbasin, Kern County, Cahuilla Subbasin, a lot of southern.
Do you think?
But there's Madera.
Yeah, Madera.
Cutting surface water to blowing holes and pulling more water, like almost forced by the state?
I know we can speculate about that. I mean,
Repeat the question.
the question was, to what extent, if I can rephrase, to what extent is the state takeover of groundwater basins related to an overarching state policy of water control? I think at this stage, Sigma still has written into it that, water resources are best managed under local control. So as the statute is written, we have that option and that ability, but there is that stick in the background. And I think, opinions are going to differ as to what the state's policy motivation is behind that. I'm not sure that it's necessarily productive for us to get into it. It does make for interesting discussion. But I think the question for us really is, how do we do it? And we could hear from everybody that what we've laid out is too expensive and you don't want to do it, in which case we need to recalibrate and figure out how we're going to avoid state intervention. Okay, so one cheap way for us to avoid state intervention is for the GSA to exercise authority as opposed to going on a voluntary basis and say that, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and just to have extraction costs and penalties. But I think that that's not as flexible as what we're trying to implement. And I'm not saying that by way of a threat. I'm just saying that if we want to avoid state intervention and spend less money on projects and management actions and on operating, we need to internalize that message and find another way to meet the same goal.
So the base, the sub base, like how we've measured and stuff, where did the base?
Unfortunately, I'm missing most of what you're saying because of the train whistle.
So where the baseline for where we should be or whatever, how was that?
So the question was, how was the baseline for where we should be formulated? And I'll just maybe briefly repeat it, and then we'll go back to this and say maybe other questions for the end. What we did was we looked at all of the available information, and we decided we need to get started on doing something to move in the right direction. So we were convinced that something needed to be done. We have preliminary quantification, but we don't think that it's certain enough for us to be able to conclusively say it has to be, 95,731 acre feet per year. Now we're saying that that's probably kind of a fuzzy target, and in order to start getting there, we'll start implementing sequential reductions in pumping, and you'll hear more about those over time. And we'll start with like 10%, then go to 20%, and then see where we are. And where those numbers come from is the ET, the satellite-based data, because that's the easiest way for.
Send them an email, send them a letter. Our client.
I would, yeah. I'd send it by email, but yeah, I would do a letter. Because, yeah, I think they're,
Somebody
I don't think they have any right.
From their attorney or just talk the shit.
So, I lost my train of thought there. So, what we did was we looked at the satellite data because that's what's available, and because the satellite data is collected, we have it actually processed all the way back to 2003. And we looked at what did the satellite data tell us about use, and we selected a baseline period from 2012 to 2021. And then we said, okay, this is our baseline. And as long as we use the same kind of approach toward assessing what the future use is, so if we use the same ET, then we can tell that we're trending in the right direction. And we'll resolve that approach, and we'll refine our targets as we go forward, but we want to get started in the first 10 years. So that means, going with the ET. Does that help?
Yeah, and so from the 43 well sites,
have you seen any improvement?
We have not yet started to implement anything except for we had about 3,500 acre feet of replenishment water in this wet year. And we've seen variability in general with some wells, we're continuing to see downward trends. Others during have kind of leveled off. So, I mean, we're seeing a mix at this point. But we do have water levels that are below our minimum thresholds in some wells. And if that persists, then it will yield to, the definition for undesirable results, which are, which require action of us. They're not necessarily actionable by the state at that point, but they require us to do something about them, and then the state watches more closely. Now, I will say, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here. I will say that we expected that those water levels were going to fall below the minimum threshold. So we have what's called an interim milestone that allows us to do that. I think there's an important question in the back.
If the levels get desirable, does this go away?
If the levels get desirable, does it go away? Presumably, if the levels, so what the aim is to get to something called a measurable objective, which allows you a certain amount of freeboard above your undesirable, above your minimum threshold, so that you can pump more during drought periods and you can have some flexibility. Once those measurable objectives are reached, what you do is you're kind of in a level flying pattern, where you manage to those measurable objectives. Does the fee go away? Probably the fee gets revised as we go. And if we get infrastructure in place and systems in place for management, hopefully those fees would go down. But the management is not going to go away, at least under the current system.
Do you think you've never stayed?
Just go up. And those baselines, they keep getting moved. So they can keep fees up.
Okay.
We should get through these.
Okay, I'll continue. So on the screen now, you see some of the benefit factors that we're using to kind of rationalize in part kind of the variance between those two rates and then the rates themselves as well. I will note that these may be reorganized a bit. Again, we're kind of in a preliminary phase here. The board has not accepted the engineer's report that kind of backs this all up yet. So there are some moving parts, but by and large, this is kind of how we're trying to evaluate the benefit received from the operational budget. The first is improved water supply management, which really is based on just improved management of water resources within the GSA's jurisdiction, with the concept in mind that that management improves availability and resilience of all water sources. Mike earlier mentioned undesirable results. The primary ones listed in the groundwater sustainability plan are chronic lowering of groundwater levels, depletion of interconnected surface water, and reduced groundwater storage. We really kind of see those as in line with improved water supply management, addressing those issues. And so we're looking at those as well as a part of that factor. The second is effective SGMA compliance. We've chatted a bit about state intervention. So this part is really about avoiding that and everything that might come with it, as well as maintaining local control. And the third one is prevention of other undesirable results. Again, these kind of may be reorganized. We may group those all together with the top one there. But as of now, these are kind of listed separately, and that's degraded water quality, and land subsidence, which are perhaps less of a concern, but as the GSP notes, still a potential concern in the future if no management actions are taken. So these are the preliminary annual rates. These may be adjusted or changed slightly. These were on some of the outreach materials that we did send out. And again, there's some moving parts here. These might be slightly adjusted, but I think these are pretty close to what the balloting will take place based on. So for irrigated parcels, that's $17.30 per acre. For non-irrigated parcels, 55 cents per acre. So note that non-irrigated rate is roughly 15% of the irrigated parcel rate. And so you can take that and look at the benefit side of it. to mean that this is really based on the concept that non-irrigated parcels receive roughly that percentage, right? Roughly 15% of benefit that irrigated parcels receive. This is kind of just a summary table for those preliminary rates and revenue. You'll notice the acres there broken down by property type. These are preliminary numbers, as well as the total acreage there, just over 137,000. When you multiply those rates by these acreage amounts, that's the revenue you get there on the revenue column. And you'll notice that number there is pretty close to that 8-year average, that annual revenue need that we established earlier. So this is just kind of how it might break down. These are projections, of course, but this is what we're looking at now.
So just for clarification, if you're currently paying the director to the East Side Water District, you won't pay these charges until those direct charges go away to 25.
Yes,
correct.
With the expiration of that assessment, you would switch over. In the interim, EWD will pay this on your behalf. So in a roundabout way, your funds are still supporting this, but not directly.
Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Those numbers will change though as we follow ground. If we follow 20,000 acres, that revenue is going to drop. They'll be charged at non-irrigated fees, right?
So I think those policy decisions are still being developed. I think that in the case where a landowner is paid to fallow, the status may not change. Because then they're getting that payment. I don't, maybe I'm misspeaking, but.
So there's two considerations there. We have a future volume-based extraction fee. That volume-based extraction fee obviously won't apply to repurposed or fallowed land. So there would be no fee charged for that, for groundwater use on that part of the property. And in terms of the per acre fee, that's a policy that we are working on and that we need to develop and finalize. At play is pretty much what Ryan said, which if you're fallowing and you want to return to non-fallowed, then in order to maintain that flexibility, you would have to pay at the irrigated rate. But if you're permanently, I'm sorry?
That's even on a delayed replanting situation?
Your delayed replanting situation, you would be paid a certain amount per acre for delaying replanting, and that would, we envision that would not change when your parcel is assessed. But you would be receiving a payment per acre for not replanting your orchard for several years.
Will Eastside Water still have fees after 2025?
Eastside Water District, once their 2025 expires, they will fold into ETSGSA. There could be a new 218 that they decide to do for a specific project or something along those lines, but there is not a plan at this moment for EWD to have an additional fee beyond what the GSA is doing.
What is the specific? This gets voted down, okay, we don't meet the 50+1. Now what happens? Does it go straight into the state?
No, two things. One is, so the question, repeating the question, what happens if this gets voted down? Does it go straight to the state? And the answer to that is no. There are a couple of considerations. One is that we have an existing assessment that's in place that would continue, but it doesn't allow us to do what we currently, that you remember the graph that moves us from overdraft to being sustainable. We would have to find a different way to achieve that with the amount of money that we have available. So either we would need to come back to you with a revised proposal that's acceptable, or what we would need to do is we would need to find a strategy that achieves that sustainability, achieves that use reduction without being able to pay for projects and achieves the same thing. And then if we can't achieve it, and the basin water levels continue to drop, then we're at risk of state intervention.
I do have a slide that provides a little more detail. Yeah. go ahead.
Is there any Sigma related funding that's being put out there to help GSAs implement the GSPs and kind of take the burden off the landowners a little bit, or any kind of talks about that kind of funding going on?
So the question was, is there any Sigma related state funding or other funding that's available to help GSAs implement these things so that it doesn't all land on the assessed public, you know, within the GSA? And the answer to that is yes. For planning, for financial planning purposes, we can't count on it. Obviously, we don't have it in hand. If an assessment is approved and we can get more grant funding, then we don't have to assess that full amount to do what we're needing to do. The passage of the assessment just allows us to go up to that amount. We can't go over that amount. So one of the things that we're very focused on is getting more grant dollars and finding creative ways to do that. And you know, to me, sort of as a personal mission, I think that spells the difference between failure and success. You know, if we can successfully bring more state dollars, which by the way, we have paid for, back into our region to address this requirement of the state, then it'll make it easier and more palatable for us to do it and maintain a viable economy. So we are actively looking at different grant programs. It's a standing item agenda on our TAC and on our board meetings. We have another grant application that we put into the Office of Planning and Research to help us with domestic well issues. And we are supposed to hear back this month if we get that grant. You know, this is another roughly $500,000. So I mean, these things come up on a regular basis. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but it's important, and the answer is yes.
I would add, one of the primary sources of grant funding for GSAs in recent years has been the Department of Water Resources Sustainable Groundwater Management Program. And they do have more information on their website. I'm not aware of any upcoming solicitations, but I think that's something that the groundwater world is tracking to look at when that might be available in the future.
Yeah, I'll just say that we recently issued a letter together with ETSGSA to the Department of Water Resources that basically reiterated these sentiments, that we think that as a legislative priority that the state needs to put more money into sustainable groundwater management if it wants to see it successfully implemented.
Based on your projections, your goal, you know, you're gonna need basically 20,000, that's $500 million worth of land that these guys are gonna have to give up in order to get to your goal. And having a few million here and there is just dropping a bucket for what the public wants. It's not that we voted for all this. We're the ones that are subjected to it. We still live by the federal standard, and that is if you're drawing next to yours more than your neighbor, well, then your neighbor could hold a claim against you. But now you just have to abjectly just cut what you're pumping. And used to be whenever your well went dry, if you're a farmer, guess what? You're screwed. That's the way it was. Well, that's probably what we should have done, is let some farmers, if we're overdrafting it, let it get critical, where some people just end up going out of business because their wells were too far away from the water source. But now you've got $500 million you're gonna take out of these people's pockets for this project, and there'll be no remuneration from the state. This is a total violation of our Fifth Amendment, and you're not supposed to be able to take property from your members without remuneration. There's no difference between this without remuneration, between this and having a British soldier being put in your house, having to take care of them, having to hold them there for no money, no reason, no purpose. But you're there to satisfy a need. We all want the groundwater to be sustainable. We just don't want it rammed down your throats with tons and tons of bureaucracy and fees. And maybe having it be done by the state is a better option. I'm not sure. The costs may weigh out.
And I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to lay out what those options are and come up with a sensible approach that the comment, I'm not going to repeat it all here, but it was basically regarding the cost of if you take 21,000 acres out of the economy, what does that cost? And is there remuneration for that, either for individuals or for the community as a whole? And what we're trying to do is develop a program that allows that to be integrated into ongoing operations, where you're not, removing wholesale blocks of land from production. Granted, if you don't have trees there, you don't have income. But what we're saying is that with the amount of water that's available as a GSA, as a community, that we need to rethink how we do it as a community. So we're trying to come up with a menu of options that allows you to integrate things like putting a 10-acre reservoir on your property, helping you with the permitting, paying you for the lost acreage, but allowing you to use it and operate it for your benefit. So those kinds of things, we would like to see implemented that kind of make it, they don't make it painless, but they make it less painful and hopefully get us to a point where we can, avoid hanging together, right? I mean, that's the only way that we're gonna be able to do this is if we find a way that makes enough sense for everybody to get behind it. And I know it's not gonna make total sense, but if it makes enough sense and meets the objectives of sustainable management, allows groundwater to be available when people need it, that's our goal.
Yeah, I think like it or not, this is a law that we all have to deal with, and we're trying to find the best path forward so we can keep as much land in production as possible and that we can have a healthy aquifer going forward. And so I don't think anyone thinks this is a panacea, an easy process. It's very challenging and there's a lot of pain in it. And we are working, everybody on this board is working very hard to make it as cost effective and have the long-term viability of the region. So I don't disagree that this feels awful, but it's what we're required to do under.
The voters ought to be helping us out, a heck of a lot more than what we're getting.
The voters didn't vote this in.
Sigma?
No, it happened with our representatives and the senators, state senators, and
They got
that's
voted in.
not us.
It got voted in.
It got voted in, you're right. And we share your sentiments. It isn't that the board is not arguing with it at all. The rest of society ought to be helping us pay for this. We're not arguing that point at all. But at this point, they're not gonna do it. Like, except through these grant programs. That was my, that's money we've all paid into taxes, right?
It's an unfunded mandate.
But that's where we are. So, this may look rough to some others, it may look pretty attractive. There's other places down the valley that these numbers are a lot lower than those. But this is where we are, okay? And I hope you guys will, we're having this meeting so we get this kind of input though. And some of that is bitching and moaning. I understand that. Others, we need to hear from the dry land people. We've gone round and around on these numbers, you guys, as a board. And these are difficult decisions, but that's why we're having this meeting.
And just so people are aware, DWR is appointed by the governor. The board is appointed by the governor. It's not an elected board. It's not an elected board.
Yeah.
So they have no bonds. They can go he wants.
So this here that you see is a tentative, oh, I'm sorry. Is there a question? Sir?
I think one thing you need to remember too is that, right now with the ag, everything's kind of depressed and even ones with trees, the commodity prices are not theirs. Some commodities are lucky to break even. And so you're getting all these fees on top of there, you're just helping to push people out.
I appreciate that. And I know that's something our board is aware of and that's a part of these discussions. We appreciate hearing from. I wanted to share kind of a tentative timeline. Oh, yeah.
Is there any plan to reduce the general population of Stanislaus County?
There is. It's not popular.
Why should the farmers bear a burden? I mean, why shouldn't Turlock have to reduce their population?
I think.
Why aren't you guys fighting to get a reduction in population?
And we're fighting for all that.
Yeah, I'm all losing Idaho.
Unmitigated flows would help the groundwater system.
Yeah. That's not her decision. That's not her decision. Go ahead, Ronnie. Let's try to get through this.
Yeah, let me get through these last couple here. So this is a tentative timeline here. There may be a slight change, but I wanted to give you kind of the proposed timeline.
Quiet, we can't hear you anyway.
Sorry about that, yeah. Thank you, folks. Let me get through these last couple here. This is a tentative timeline. These things may switch and change a little bit, but this is what we're looking at right now. At the board meeting later today and over the course of the next month, the board will review the engineer's report and we will be refining it. Coming back to the board meeting in January, the board potentially may accept that preliminary engineer's report, at which point the balloting could then commence. So ballots may be mailed out in late January. That's kind of what we're looking at now. Then we would have that 60-day voting period that I mentioned earlier. And the board could reconvene either in late March or in April for that ballot tabulation and to kind of finally accept that engineer's report potentially. If greater than 50% or 50% plus one support is achieved from the balloting, then the assessment could be implemented by the board at that point. So this is kind of the general timeline we're looking at for this process. We did talk about this already a bit. What happens if the assessment is not successful? We talked about the possibility of state intervention. We talked about the possibility that the GSA would have to look at other ways to try to get this done. We would be looking at the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the California Water Code and what options those might be. But as Mike mentioned, we're trying to find a flexible enough process and whatever that optimal process is to get where we need to go. We did talk about state intervention a bit earlier. This information here is available on the State Water Board website. As Mike noted, we don't know a ton about how this shakes down. I think the first handful of basins where this might be taking place, that process has just kind of started earlier this year. So we're all kind of tracking that, but on the State Water Board, website, it's clear that local input would be limited in the event of a state takeover or a state intervention. That groundwater users would likely be required to register wells, install meters, report to the state, and that there would be some form of charges or fees imposed. And those look like what they list on the website is $300 per well, and $40 to $55 per acre foot extracted annually, and potentially $100 per de minimis well. So we don't know exactly that hasn't happened yet, but that's what they list on their website. And that's kind of what we look to as a benchmark for what might happen if this were to take place. The other piece of that is the state, as Mike mentioned, could restrict pumping and then impose penalty fees for overdraft based on those restrictions. And the other thing to note here is that this is not intended to be a permanent solution, that the GSA would still be expected to correct any deficiencies in the plan or in its implementation of the plan and kind of get back on its feet as well. And so I don't think the state looks at this as a long-term solution, but rather kind of a temporary solution. Question?
If the state were to step in and impose those pumping charges that you just, for example, that you put up here, would the state return those monies to the GSA for the continued, the local GSA for the continued implementation of a plan? Or would that be a punitive fee that would go to the state coffer and would just be out of the area?
I believe that goes to the state coffer, at least in principle. The idea would be that would support their efforts to manage the basin in the interim, I believe.
Yeah, those are fees that will be used to fund the state's activities in the basin. So it's essentially their cost of operation.
So then local fees to continue to implement would be on top of that.
Yeah, correct.
Are you gonna discuss, any extraction fee plans today? Outside, in this meeting, not the next meeting, but to give us an idea of what, extraction fees might look like? Are you guys thinking $40 to $50 a foot?
So we are in preliminary discussions about that now, and within that kind of base tier, it was far lower than that. But at this point, we don't know exactly what that's gonna look like. There's likely going to be some overdraft tiers implemented where when you go over a certain amount of acre feet per acre, it jumps up. But that base charge was much lower than that at our last discussion. That's something we don't really feel comfortable giving a ton of detail on because it keeps changing and we're not exactly sure what it's gonna look like. But it'll be discussed at board meetings in the coming months, and there will absolutely be at least one workshop to go over that.
And I think also it's critically important that if this doesn't pass, you don't have the funding to operate the GSP. And so we will have to go to an alternative way of funding that. And pumping fees might be how it gets funded. But, so it's preliminary to say what those numbers would be.
There's a number of other things that are in play as well. I mean, we're still working with TID in terms of our water accounting. And that could potentially affect the pumping cost as well.
How has TID been about like possibilities of like providing more surface water?
They really want to see us about providing more surface water. You know, I think that they want to help us as much as they can. I think they tend to be pretty conservative about making commitments before they're really ready to. The big game changer would be their pending water rights application on the Tuolumne River, and the outcome of that is uncertain. And they are, we are actively talking about them committing a certain amount of water under the replenishment program, which is much larger than what we've been using. And we've on the table has been discussing up to about a total of 35,000 acre feet during years when it's available, which traditionally has been about roughly 2/3 of years. Sarah, do you have anything to?
No, I would just say, you know, we're in this basin together with TID and with West Turlock in total. And they are actively interested and talking with us about how are there mutually beneficial programs that we can put in place. So I think they are very willing to and trying to be a good partner with us in this process.
Same from Merced Irrigation District?
Yes, for sure.
And the difference district is on our board and on our tax, so we interact with them. You know, when we interact with them, we're on the same side of the table. Put it that way.
The programs that you had listed on that graph, where the red was on this side and the implementing the programs to try to work toward that thing, are any of those in place now?
So her question was of the graph that we showed, moving from all pumping to pumping and projects and some demand management. Are any of the projects in place? I think this year was an excellent example of the replenishment water. Historically, we were taking around 1,000 acre feet of replenishment water when it was available from TID. And this year we were able to take 3,800 acre feet. So, and we had some infrastructure projects that we put in place that connected landowners to that replenishment water. And that helped increase our numbers tremendously. So that's one that is in place that is part of that project. We hope to expand that considerably. But there are also new recharge projects that have been going in over the last year that landowners independently have been doing on their own. So they're beginning.
About the delayed orchard replanting, is that?
We have not started the delayed orchard replanting program yet.
About I'm sorry, the portal for the Land IQ information, is that up and running?
The portal for Land IQ is not up and running. We just had a discussion about this on Tuesday. We are hopeful that we are able to select a company and a off-the-shelf portal that we can immediately bring in and start using and sharing with landowners in the early spring. So we're hoping to get that before the board in March. So that hopefully in the short few months after that, it's available to landowners to utilize.
So the plan for that is we've had a pilot program this year where we had, I think it was about between 10 and 20 growers participate, where we've been looking at kind of a trial portal, trial data, comparing it to meter data and so forth. We're working through that analysis right now. And that should be available in February is when we're planning for that to be available. About the same time as developing next steps for a report that would be available for everybody for data for the next irrigation season, so that they can see how things are progressing. And a fee would not be implemented at that time. You could just see how it's working. And what was the, MLRP, multi-benefit land repurposing, you know, we've got our grant, we're just starting to, put our plan together. Putting our plan together will take about a year. And then, probably starting in 2025, we would start, dispersing funds for projects and for repurposing, out in the GSA.
So,
Yes.
if you were to dig and develop a retention pond on your property, would that qualify as habitat credit? And if so, what is that credit?
So the question was, if you were to dig and develop a retention pond on your property, would that qualify as a habitat credit? And if so, what is that credit? So let me clarify a couple of things. So under the MLRP program, what we'll have is certain options for repurposing land. One of them is going to be that kind of basin. And what we would do is we would develop standard specifications by which that's implemented. And then if your proposal is, you know, your proposal would be scored, and if it's accepted, you would get a certain amount of dollars per acre per year for implementing that. And that would be for a 10-year horizon. So for a 10-year period, you would get that money per year per acre. So it's not a habitat credit per se. It's a repurposing credit. The other benefit that it potentially has for you is you might get recharge on your property. And we haven't yet worked through our policies regarding recharge credits, but you know, there's potential that could be considered there. You could use that water for irrigation during the early irrigation season. So, you know, potentially it could shave, you know, a couple of inches off of your water demand, depending on the storage size and how well it fills up. And what I was talking about in terms of potential other credits, if it becomes habitat that can be put into like a mitigation bank kind of situation, like a regional biological mitigation bank, there's the potential for getting credit and being able to sell those credits to, you know, somebody in Turlock that wants to take out 5 acres of wetland and needs to pay for a certain number of acres of wetland ponds to be developed up here. That's kind of pie in the sky at this point, but it's one of the possibilities that we would look at when we put our plan together. I think we have questions on the chat that we just, I mean, in fairness to, I think we got, well, we had up to over 40 people on the chat at one point, but I would probably go through those and make sure that we've aired them and answered them. So, do you want me to do that or?
Yeah, I mean, you have answered most of them. I think we had somebody identified, we had an error in our slide, the January 2024 was not identified, different year. So it is January 2024 that we are bringing it before the board and starting the 218 process. The other question that came up, let's see here. Just so you all know in the room, somebody asked if we post a copy of the slide deck. We will. It will be on the Turlock Subbasin website and available there for you to view.
There was a question about estimate of sustainable yield in terms of acre feet per acre. And just reiterate, we don't claim to know the exact sustainable yield at this point. The average demand for ET demand for that 2012 to 2021 period per irrigated field acre was 2.82 feet. per irrigated parcel acre, that's gonna change a little bit. We're cranking through that. It'll probably be smaller because the fields are smaller than the parcels. And then, we have the potential reduction targets that we would hit that would take it down to below the 2.82 feet. Down to like 2.5 feet, in the first 5 years and 2.26, I think, after that. So those numbers are subject to change. That kind of gives you a feel for what you might expect over the next 10 years.
Then the last one I see is, and it's a good question, will growers be able to move water or water credits from WTGSA to ETGSA in long water years? And I think because we do not have a credit system in place, it's too early to say what will be able to be moved around. But we continue to work with WTSGSA on what overall groundwater pumping will look like and what a credit system might be between the two. I think preliminary, it will all be within ETSGSA. We will need to shore up what's happening on our own side first, and then expanding that would be a secondary measure. But, and then does captured rainwater count for recharge credits? Again, we don't have any credits that are building, but as far as rainwater and the creeks that flow into the basin, we are very interested and looking into, as part of our projects, how we can maintain those rainfall and creeks that come through the basin, how we maintain that in ETSGSA for purposes of recharge. And so we are hoping that we can have better percolation of that rainfall and keep it here in the basin and go into the aquifer. So there's not a credit associated with that yet, but there is a desire to keep as much in ETSGSA through rainfall and the creeks as possible.
So there may be a credit in the future. We just haven't worked through policies for those credits.
There was a question in the back.
So to your point about these potential diversion and recharge projects, I think we all in this room appreciate just how difficult it is to work with the regulatory agencies when you try to take on one of these projects. My question, I guess, is, have you folks approached these regulatory agencies in today's political environment to see what kind of acceptance there will be for an expedited permitting and implementation process?
Right.
Because we could talk all day about how great it would be to divert water and recharge our groundwater sub-basin, but that could be an unachievable goal.
So I can probably take that. The question was regarding the difficulty of permitting diversion and recharge projects, and have we looked at, that it's all well and good to talk about that as a concept, but the reality is that the permitting is difficult. Two-tiered answer to the question in terms of actual riparian or appropriative diversions and recharge. That's not something that we have looked at yet at this point. We are watching, to the extent that there are, programs to streamline that. We certainly have our eyes on that, and we'll deal with that in the future. The rights on the Tuolumne River, we're really looking for TID to take the lead on that. So we're talking about our local creeks. So Sarah can probably weigh in on some of those things. We are looking at those potential diversions. In terms of land repurposing and the permitting for it, I talked about the beaver dam analogs and things of that nature. We are working with sustainable conservation on identifying potential streamlined permitting approaches that would help us to address, Army Corps and streambed alteration requirements, as well as endangered species requirements. And that will be looked at as part of a permitting plan that's developed under our MLRP plan. And there's a statewide support entity that has been put together to support that whole program among all the block grant recipients. And they are looking specifically at some of those issues. Are there ways that we can get safe harbor permits from endangered species and other programmatic permits to comply with, Clean Water Act requirements and, Fish and Game Code requirements.
I do want to add to that just real quickly. One DWR funding source that we got prior to the GSP being completed was money to do a programmatic environmental impact report for the entire basin. And that did address projects like recharge and the environmental review, those kinds of activities. They were not site specific, but they were broadly for the entire basin. So that is a document that we will use as a foundation for doing a lot of these recharge projects. So we will have to do more environmental work, but a lot of the foundational work was done and covered by a grant. So that is very helpful for our basin, that we have that baseline kind of established for some of these permitting challenges that we may have. And so I just want to make sure you knew that that was in place already. And then, Mike, there's a good question here. If a property owner starts planting irrigated crops on previously non-irrigated land after the 218 process, will they be assessed back fees and as if they were irrigated prior?
So we don't have an official opt-in policy yet. That is something that we're gonna need to develop. And the back fees question would be addressed at that point. Certainly going forward, they would be assessed at the irrigated rate. But it doesn't, it certainly shouldn't be a foregone conclusion that would be backward looking if the parcel wasn't irrigated historically. I mean, I think that's more a going forward question.
Let's go here.
Some of the things you've described that you have additional funding for, when a person thought they had a piece of land that would be perfect for some of this, who would they talk to?
Either Mike or myself, we would love to hear from you if you think that there's opportunities for these kinds of projects on your property. I mean, we need to know from you all what works best for you, and so we definitely want to hear from you. Actually, let me go to the front real quick and I'll come to you.
Is Eastside Water District the only stakeholder in East Turlock paying an assessment now?
Yes, there is a GSA assessment in place today. So for that passed, I believe, 2 years ago. And Belico Cortez collects an assessment for their landowners as well.
So all the parcels currently are paying, they're just paying at a different rate.
The assessment that's in place today for the GSA is not adequate to meet the budgetary needs of the ongoing operations and implementation of the GSP. And sorry, you had a question.
I don't know if you guys would be as part of it or the Belico Crestby deal. We've kind of got there's a flood area there by the Turlock Airport, called Mustang Creek, that hasn't been used for as long as I know. It can be filled, and it's never been filled. I don't know why the system that's in there doesn't get used.
Well, you're correct. It can be used. And this year, for the first time in a long time, we were able to utilize the Mustang Creek and the detention basin. We have been working with TID on how to operate that detention basin upstream of the airport, that we can hold water there for percolation purposes and possibly to bring water off onto neighboring irrigation for in lieu use. And our goal is to hold water in the dam as long as possible so that we can use that. And TID's goal is flood protection of their infrastructure. So we're trying to find a balancing act of how we both can operate that together, still get recharge activities and move things off into the airport pond when there's high enough flow. But it takes a pretty high flow to get water to go into that airport. But that is one of our main ongoing projects, is to operate that to the benefit of the area where we hold as much water back so it can be used for in lieu or recharge purposes.
Now, is that something, since I am on the Mustang Creek there, and when it does run high, could I tap into that for a recharge into my field?
Very possibly, but don't just go do it. Talk to us about it, please, and we can work through if it can be done or not.
When it's high, from full flow, whatever, sometimes. I can actually divert, or
Okay.
not divert, if I gain adequate water into my.
Well, we definitely would want to talk about it and figure out if there's something we could do. Well, thank you all very much. There was a lot of, yeah, we have one more question. Oh, sorry.
I have no question, I have a comment. I would like to thank you guys for all your effort you put in this. None of us know what's going on. And I think we're all in agreement on that. But I do know that you guys are putting a lot of effort into it and quite a lot of donated. And we really should appreciate you guys for what you're doing. And that said, make it easy.
We're trying. Thank you.
Thank you all. Okay. Now, we are a different Zoom link and a different agenda. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's probably the same thing.
Cal. How are you?
Potentially, I mean, we'll look on